Berens. He was ordained a priest in 2015 and has served as an associate pastor, is currently a chaplain for In Ipso in the Salina Diocese. He received his undergraduate degree in biology and pursued medicine until the Lord called him to be a doctor of the soul. He received a certificate from the National Catholic Bioethics Center and a master's degree from the University of Mary in biomedical ethics. When I was thinking about speakers for today, I think Father Kyle's about the best person, especially local, to speak about some of these topics with truth and knowledge and compassion. So I'm very excited that he's with us here today. So let's welcome Father Kyle.
Good. Well, thank you, Gina. So not an easy topic to talk about. It's something that can cause some emotions to get high. So actually, whenever I talk about reproductive technology, I like to just make a few disclaimers beforehand, just so we can get them out of the way. And so the first one is obviously I'm going to be talking about reproduction. That requires us to talk about some very explicit kind of things, because I don't like to use euphemisms or analogies, because it kind of muddies the water when you're talking about sexual reproduction and those kind of things. So I just want to be that forewarned that we're going to be talking about that kind of material, because we're going to be talking about in vitro fertilization and different things of that nature in each step, because I find that the only way to really clearly understand the moral principles at stake in a lot of these different reproductive technologies is you have to break them down step by step. And you can see, especially with in vitro fertilization, which we'll get to at the end, there are moral problems in almost every step of the process that is most often never explained to anybody. So I like to try to explain all that so that we can have clarity. So a second thing is, I know that some people are struggling with infertility. It's on the rise in our country. It's more and more common. In the marriage prep that I do, there's a lot of couples that are struggling with infertility. So I just want to be sensitive to that reality of when talking about reproductive technologies, it's a real suffering that couples face more and more these days for all sorts of reasons. Like Shauna's presentation was absolutely beautiful. I myself have had a lot of health problems that I've found nutrition is the best medicine, way better than traditional things that Western medicine gives us. And I've seen that also help a lot of couples with infertility. So there's more answers than the extreme of like IVF, in vitro fertilization, or some of the other surgical procedures that they recommend, where if you go into some doctors, the first thing they do is the pill and surgery and these things, where there's a lot of other options. So I just want to admit, I understand that struggle is difficult. I have some personal, not me personally, struggling with infertility, obviously, as a Catholic priest, but my mother was incapable of having children, of bearing children, so I myself am adopted. So I understand that from a suffering that my mother went through, of the adoption process, the pain of not being able to have her own children, of sharing that with me and those kind of things. But I also see the beauty of her choice, my parents' choice, both my birth parents and my adoptive parents. So I'm grateful for that aspect. So I just want to throw that out there. And the final thing that kind of ties into reproductive technology is we, as pro-life people, always say that every child is a gift. But the hard part is that when infertility mixes into that equation, the giftedness of life becomes something that I'm owed. And then because I'm not able to have what I want, which is a child, which we recognize as a gift, I'll go to almost any means to get what the gift I want. And it's no longer a gift, now it's a demand. And so we just have to be very careful about making sure that we protect fully this understanding that life indeed is a gift. We, especially as Christians, right, we believe in a God who has to intentionally himself create every soul from nothing out of his love. Doesn't matter how often a technician unites a sperm and an egg in a petri dish, or a husband and a wife come together, they can do everything they want to. But if God himself does not cooperate in that process, nothing happens. Because we can't make souls as human beings. God alone can create a soul, and that's what we mean by every child is a gift. So if God in his almighty mercy and love is allowing, even in these horrendous ways like in vitro fertilization and the rest, for children to be conceived, he knows what he's doing, and he knows what good he'll bring out of that. So we have to sometimes be patient and struggle to find and cooperate with his will in the midst of all of that. It's really good for us to recognize what does it mean when we say that every child is a gift, and to make sure also that when our suffering is involved in that process, that we don't start to see that gift as something I'm owed or that I deserve, but it's something that still is, I'll use what means the Lord allows, but not go outside of that in order to receive the gift of a child. So in order to help us kind of dig into some of these topics, I want to actually first give sources, because what I've always learned in talks is I always love to have something I can take from the talk and learn about later. So a couple of these sources that are very helpful is this book. Is if you have biomedical questions, and just from a basic Christian standpoint, this guy's a Catholic priest, but he does a really good job of just going through all of the different things from beginning of life to end of life to informed consent and everything. It's kind of the textbook that we use, but it's not really just written as a textbook. It's written for even a layperson to understand. It's not filled with a bunch of jargon. So it's called Biomedicine and Beatitude. Really good book. You can just look up topically. It has a great index in it. Another good resource are for any kind of medical ethics. This is put out by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, USCCB. It's called the Ethical and Religious Directives for Catholic Healthcare Services. Super short, straight to the point. It's kind of what guides a lot of medicine in the United States because a majority of medicine is owned by Catholic institutions. Now, I'll admit that most of them fail at implementing this because they've kowtowed to money and insurance companies, but that is our guiding principle, and it kind of gives us, again, some of the foundational principles that we should understand. The final thing, and probably what's most helpful, is there is a free 24/7 hotline and ethical service that's provided by the National Catholic Bioethics Center that's staffed by licensed and certified ethicists at all times. So if ever you have a question, if you're in the hospital, a loved one is sick, whatever it might be, I use them fairly often. I direct other priests and people to use them, called the National Catholic Bioethics Center. They have a website. On the website, you can find their phone number. It's a very good resource. So just those are some things that are just good to have out there in the beginning. Okay, so the topic that we're talking about today is reproductive technologies, the good, the bad, and the church, or you can say the Lord, essentially, because even anything that the Catholic Church is teaching is directly scripturally based, is based off of our understanding of the human person, which is a universal understanding. And so the two basic principles that we can understand with all reproductive technology that we have to follow in order to follow God's loving plan for families and life and the rest is we can assist the natural process, we cannot substitute it. And so this is a very simple, straightforward, clear way of understanding of how to judge something that we're being invited to do in medicine or whatever. We can assist the natural process of a sperm and an egg uniting together in a woman's body and finding and implanted in the uterus and coming to full term and being born. We can assist that process, but we can never substitute for any part of that process. We can't take it over and do it ourselves. And so I'll point this out more clearly as we go through some specific examples, but that's the basic principle that guides pretty much all of sexual ethics, medical sexual ethics, is are we assisting what God has given us to do, or are we taking over? Are we taking charge for ourselves because we have no way to assist? And those are ways where we start to play God. So it's just good for us to recognize that reality. The other thing that's important, of course, is as we're talking about these different technologies, the reality is, especially with the main thing that we'll kind of talk about, which is called in vitro fertilization, which is the fertilization of an egg by sperm in glass. In vitro in Latin means in glass, so it's in a petri dish or a test tube. This is what's famously called the test tube babies and those kind of things. Unfortunately, the statistics say that those who profess to love Christ, to be Christian, Catholic or Christian, use IVF to the same degree as the secular society. So there's no difference, statistically, between those who claim to follow God and those who claim to not care in their use of a gravely immoral process. And so just as a pastor, as a priest, and just as faithful Christians, we have to ask the question, where have we gone wrong? Because clearly people are either misinformed or uninformed or something about these processes and don't understand how to make a good moral judgment of it. So with that reality too comes there have been 12 million children alone who have been conceived and born via IVF since 1978. And the hard part when you talk about this subject is that those children who have born that way, and you speak about how that process is immoral, they think that they're immoral. And so I want to just say it very clearly, is every child conceived, born or not born, every child conceived has infinite dignity, is a gift, and is beautiful and wonderful, no matter how they were conceived. Right? We all know this. And there's a great priest who talks about this, Father Tad. I can never say his last name. It's Polish. Yeah. He's phenomenal, and he makes a good point. He says that if a child is conceived via some other immoral means, say fornication or rape or whatever, we still say that child has infinite dignity. We're not saying anything different with children born of artificial reproductive technologies. So it's just good to make sure that's known, because I've had this experience, and he speaks about this experience of if you're talking at a church or something like that, people come up and say, "Are you saying my grandkid is evil and bad?" And like, well, no. We're not saying anything about the lives of people. We're just talking about the decisions that they make and how they make them. So what does the church teach when it comes to some of these? So I'll just read a few quotes from the Catechism of the Catholic Church to give us a little bit of authority to some of these things. Of things that I've already said, actually. So actually in these ERDs, as they're called, the Ethical and Religious Directives, which is a summary of a lot of other papal and church documents, a summary of a lot of other things that just kind of come down into this one thing. It states reproductive technologies that substitute for the marriage act are not consistent with human dignity. So again, you have that language of substitution. We can never substitute for what God has given us. Just as the marriage act is joined naturally to procreation, so procreation is joined naturally to the marriage act. So again, this is just this understanding of the purpose of marriage is the union of spouses and the procreation of children, and we have to support that at all times. And we can't get rid of one of those aspects, contraception. There's this great line that contraception is sex without babies, and in vitro fertilization is babies without sex. And so they're two sides of the same coin. And so talking about one, you essentially are talking about the other because they share a similar mentality, an anti-life mentality. And so those are things where it's good for us to just be aware of. So another good understanding is research aimed at reducing human sterility is to be encouraged, on condition that it is placed at the service of the human person. And that's not just the woman or the man, but also the child. We have to keep all persons involved in our minds, of his inalienable rights, and of his true and integral good according to the design and the will of God. So techniques that entail the dissociation of husband and wife. So this gives us some clear understanding. So techniques that are used that do not require a husband and wife to be together are clearly things that are not assisting the natural process. These are examples would be surrogacy and anything that requires a third party. So if it requires a technician to perform one part of the sexual act, so to speak, getting the sperm where it needs to go, getting the egg where it needs to go, if it requires a third party, you're introducing a third party into the marital act, and everybody knows otherwise, if you explain it differently, that we would not ever do that, right? Invite a third person into the marriage bedroom. But yet when we couch it in scientific medical language, we are all of a sudden okay with that. And so there are certain kind of technologies that are being used currently it's called GIFT or ZIFT, gamete intrafallopian tube transfer, which is what happens is they'll take, usually the egg can get there, this is if there's a sperm problem. The problem is often in order to collect this sperm sample it requires the man often to masturbate, which is sinful. So already you start with a sinful act. There is a way that is approved for that, which is a married couple can use what's called a perforated condom, essentially, a condom with holes in it, during a normal marital act. And that can collect the sample, and then they would actually, a technician then would insert the sperm where it needs to go in the woman's fallopian tube. And again, this seems fine. It seems like we're just trying to help things work the way they are. But again, the big problem that we face as Christians who want to protect the sanctity of the marriage and the sanctity of the relationship between a man and a woman in marriage is you're introducing a third party to the act that is sacred to marriage. And so we have to be very careful of how we're doing that and why we're doing that. And because the problem is we might think, well, that doesn't seem that bad, but if you allow it for that purpose, then science will say, well, you allowed it once, so we'll do it for everything. And so we also have to be aware of how these things can be taken and run with in the scientific community, in the medical community, to be excuses to use for all sorts of things. So that can be done with gametes, that can be done with a zygote, which is a fertilized egg, a human being. And that's what's done in vitro fertilization, which will kind of explain some more of these examples a little bit more clearly. So I think that gives us a lot of the basic principles. And honestly, I think the best way to understand them and to kind of dig into them is just to go through some very clear practical examples of how it's used and what's good and what's bad. So when I was kind of praying about and thinking about what are the good things that can be done, I mean, there's a good list of them, and I'm not an expert in that, because unfortunately, as an ethicist, you never get to deal with the nice things. You don't really get to deal with the questions of what's going well. We often have to deal with what didn't go well and how do we understand and why. And a lot of the good things there are good hormonal treatments, and you don't have to just use synthetic hormones these days. There's other things that are available, and honestly, the Paul VI Institute, Shauna, who's here, who just had a phenomenal talk about these things, can give you much better information than I, just as a Catholic priest, who of course know some medicine and those kind of things, but I think that they can speak better to the proper use of surgical corrections with endometriosis and those sorts of things. So for me, it's more of my wheelhouse, if you will, to talk about some of the bad of what goes on, to help us understand the moral principles that can guide us in any of these decisions. So I'm going to use IVF, as I've mentioned a number of times, which again is in vitro fertilization. In vitro, in glass fertilization. So the bringing together of a sperm and an egg in glass. Often, this whole process today is a very sad reality that I mentioned before, 12 million babies since 1978, when Louise Brown, who was the first test tube baby that was brought to full term, was born. And so since then, it's actually, I guess, can anyone probably guess what country this is actually most prevalent in, IVF? We like to think America, but it's actually not. It's most prevalent in China and Japan. Two countries that have spent decades upon decades of trying to destroy their populations through birth control and the rest, are now finding that they have very little chance of recovering their population. And so they are turning to these other means to try to force a population boom. And so in America, it's taken on a little bit different of a thing, because we're not trying to solve that problem. But unfortunately, IVF and how it's done has become even Pope Francis has made a number of comments about this. We've made children a commodity. And I'll explain how we've done that through this process. So the process of IVF is simply this. It's a man and a woman who are struggling to conceive a child show up to an in vitro fertilization clinic. And that clinic, unfortunately, because informed consent laws, as our first speaker spoke about, are not always the greatest, does not have to inform that couple of the particulars of how every step of the process works before they begin it. They only have to inform them about certain things, and every clinic does it differently depending on what state you're in and different laws, and so it gets crazy. But in these IVF clinics, this couple who's suffering, because infertility is a hard cross to bear, are looking for any answer that they can have as far as how can they find the gift to be parents. And so they're told that this is a cure for infertility. They're given statistics about how many children have been born this way. And they're given all of the positive statistics to encourage them to go through this process. The hard part is technically in vitro fertilization doesn't have anything to do with fertility because we substitute the whole process by science. So it's not a cure for infertility. It's a substitute for infertility. So then once the process begins, often, even very quickly in the process, they'll encourage the man to go back to a room set aside in the place where they can then commit a sin of masturbation in order to get a sperm sample. And then in order to get the eggs from the woman, who sometimes is struggling with different disease processes within her fertility and the rest, they give her these super ovulatory drugs. And again, informed consent, and I'll say that a lot because one of the big principles within the Catholic Church and just in general in medical ethics is informed consent, which we think in America we do a good job of, but we're actually abysmal. We do horribly. Doctors either don't know or they do know and they don't tell their patients. We heard about this with Shauna and the birth control pill. And so I like to just tell people always, when dealing with doctors in medicine, you have the right, and I would even encourage you, you always should be asking questions. Always telling them, no, I want to know why. I want to know what you're doing. Tell me exactly what's happening. They have to give you those answers. And if they don't, leave. And I know that they might be the only source or whatever, but like God can provide, and we have to make sure we know what we're receiving and why we're receiving it. We don't have to just be dumb animals who trust the doctor because we were told to. And they even taught us this when I was in medical school. It's like, that's what people say, but we need to change that mentality, right? So I was glad that they said that. So in order to harvest these eggs from the woman, they give her these super ovulatory chemicals, these hormones and different things. And the hard part is often they don't give them the risk factors. They say, oh, well, it's just a normal process. A lot of women do it. It'll be kind of painful for a couple of days. But the truth is that there's been women who have died because of this. There's at least 3 cases more recently that have happened just in the last couple of months, I think, in Europe. Severe pain, severe bleeding, hospitalization. The process itself requires a needle, a very long needle that is a transvaginal needle to get to the ovary. It's a very painful process that they just treat as like, well, this is what we normally do. It's fine. It's not a big deal. So the technicians then harvest the egg and the sperm, and then some other technician puts them together in a petri dish. And unfortunately, what happens often is they harvest somewhere between 10 to 20 eggs and fertilize all of them. So now you have 10 to 20 children in a petri dish. So already I think you can see all the different moral difficulties we have in this process, and we haven't even gotten very far. So then here comes the worst parts of this process, especially in the modern day, now that we have so much genetic testing and the ability to do all of that. They will then genetically test all of those children who have been conceived. Once they're at the 8-cell stage, we start as 1 cell and then it starts doubling. So once they're at the 8-cell stage, they will rip a cell out of that 8-cell group. So you can imagine if they took 1/8 of your current body weight to do tests on. That's what we're doing to our children, and we just call it genetic testing, pre-implantation genetic testing. And in the midst of that, right, it's okay that if you want to do genetic testing on yourself to know what could happen, to take steps to better understand is wonderful. But when we start genetically testing children, it's often for the purpose of getting rid of something we don't want. And that's what happens in this process. And they don't tell couples this at all. They don't have to. They're not required. They'll just say, oh, we'll do some genetic testing and make sure that, we get the best options possible. But what happens is they will automatically reduce or throw away or kill any child that has trisomy. Any child that has any genetic misformation or anything like that, they'll automatically just get rid of them.
And they don't tell the parents.
Right. Yeah. So it depends on state of whether or not they have to tell the parent or not. But again, the language that's used is this is not a child. It's just, it's a cell mass, it's a whatever, right? So they're just getting rid of extra cells is how they kind of put it forward. This is why that culture of death kind of language lends itself to disconnect ourselves from the person that's involved. So within that genetic testing, they then will give each of those embryos a score of 1 to 3, and those who do not score high enough are disposed of. Generally, out of that 10 to 20 children that are conceived, they'll find maybe 10 that are what they call viable and worth it. Where this has become a commodity in America is this genetic testing is now used to kind of design the children, unfortunately. So in this step, and in the step of choosing the sperm and the egg, it's no longer just between a married couple. They're now inviting anonymous sperm donors, and they're even paying upwards of $50,000 to $100,000 to women, to college girls especially is who they target, to donate their eggs for this purpose. So you get a nice lean girl who's got good ACT scores and is great in sports and the rest, and they'll pay a ton of money if she has a certain racial background. So you see where this is no longer, we're not dealing with human beings, we're dealing with design. Our design, not God's design. So even if it is between a husband and a wife, those children then, in order to then get to the point of a child being not just conceived but brought to term, we need a womb. And often, if the mother, the wife, is capable of bearing that child, they'll then implant a child into that mother's womb. But unfortunately, the success rate of implantation is very low. So they don't just transfer one embryo. The normal practice is 3 to 5. Hoping only one sticks. But unfortunately, very often more than one will implant. And we all know the high-risk reality of multiplets, of having more than one child in one pregnancy. And so then they'll do what they call selective reduction, which we know is abortion. So they'll let the children grow to a certain point, find out which one's doing the best, and then kill off their brothers and sisters, so as to give that one the best option. They won't call it abortion. They won't say anything about that. They'll call it selective reduction. So again, I hope you can see that the language they're using, and I'm not a legislator and I'm not that part of it, but I wish that we could force them to use the actual reality of what's going on in their language they have to put in their pamphlets and the rest, because I guarantee you no one would do this. If they knew exactly, well, okay, some people would still do it, but if they knew exactly what was going on, a lot of the Christians and those who are also using this would hesitate at the very least, I hope. So once they get to that point, they didn't use all of the embryos conceived for that first round, and so they'll put the ones they didn't use on liquid nitrogen, freezing the children for later use. And so currently the difficulty we have with that is there's over 500,000 children who have been frozen in liquid nitrogen, and most of those have been orphaned. Their parents got their one girl and their one boy, or whatever their perfect family was, from this process. They designed what they wanted, their blue-eyed girl or whatever it was, and the rest of the children they don't want. And so they're left to just be frozen. This brings up deep moral questions for us, because what can we do with those children? And I actually was at a retreat the last weekend and leading one, and one of the ladies asked me this question. We weren't even talking about this topic, but her daughter is struggling with fertility, and they're looking for these kind of different options, and she was asking me about it, and I was grateful she did. Because when it comes to this moral question, once we get to this point of the frozen embryos, the question is, what can we do with those frozen embryos? So I'll give a couple of different understanding that is generally the consensus of most ethicists these days, both Christian and non-Christian, but it's not a set understanding. And the church itself, Catholic Church, has not spoken definitively on this topic. If it's the husband and wife whose children they are, so those children belong to this husband and wife, I argue, and a lot of people argue, they have an obligation to try to bring all of those children to term. If they've already started the process, they've already done IVF, they've already conceived these children in vitro, and they've been frozen. They've got what they wanted from it, so to speak, but they have extra children. They have to, I would say, because they've started the process, they have to finish the process. And while that involves a lot of moral difficulties, it involves a technician who puts the child in the mother's womb and all those rest, because the evil process has already been started, we have to do the best we can at this point. And the best we can is to give those children a home, to give them the chance to live. So that's the easiest part of it. If it's your children, you bring them to birth. You do all you can for that. Then it comes to the question of there are women who are fertile, they can have their own children, whatever, but they see all these abandoned children, would like to give their womb, so to speak, for this child to come to birth and bring them into a family. And so this is called the Snowflake Program, is what it's called, and it's essentially embryo adoption, is another way to understand it. The difficulty with this is it requires another moral evil, which is called surrogacy. A woman is getting pregnant by a man who's not her husband. And if we start just saying, yeah, this is fine in this case, again, what society will do is we've already caved on so many moral principles, they'll just run with it. And then surrogacy becomes a thing that, oh, see, Christians are okay with surrogacy, so let's just all do that. And so while it's painful to say this is a step we cannot take, it is something that we have to always be aware of. How do we protect not just the most good for the most people kind of thing, we're not utilitarians, but how do we protect the principles that ultimately lead us to continually protecting life from this day forward? And surrogacy, because it is a break in that natural process, is not something we can support. Now, I'll give this caveat to this reality of those frozen embryos being adopted and being brought to term with a woman who's not the mother of those children. It's a debated question. And so technically what the Catholic Church would say is the individual needs to inform their conscience according to what is actually going on. And then they're free to choose according to their informed conscience, either way, to adopt that child and bring that child to term, or to not do so. I don't love giving that answer, but that's the technical answer, and that's the answer that I have to give because I'm not God. I'm not in charge, and I'm not the spokesman for the church. I speak for the church, but I'm not the one who decides for the church. So I think it's good, though, to inform our conscience of while our heart bleeds for these children who've been abandoned and frozen, we have to make sure that we're not doing something evil so as to bring about a good. We are never allowed to do evil to bring about good. In the example of a couple whose children have been frozen, they've already begun the evil. So they're not doing an evil to bring about a good. They're just finishing off the evil product so as to do the best that they can. But the woman whose children they are not, the surrogate is inviting and is starting to go down a moral pathway that is at the beginning evil to bring about a good that unfortunately we have the situation. And so the other possibility that I think is the more moral choice, and I think that has the whole human person in mind, is because medicine has never stopped to ask the question of should we be doing this, right? That's never the question that scientists ask. They said we can do it, therefore we will. And then we have ethicists who come in and say, yeah, but should we be doing this? Is a bigger question. Because they will not listen to that question, they've gone ahead and created a problem that we don't have a solution for. And so it requires us to wait, and there is a lot of work being done on this for artificial wombs. So these children can be brought to term in something that doesn't involve surrogacy. So we don't have to involve another evil in order to try to do good. And so that's something that's being worked on. I haven't done any recent research on it, but there was quite a bit of work being done on it, especially by these pro-life groups that want to find a solution that doesn't involve more sinful options. Yeah.
Problem with that is, like you said, you do this one thing and society takes and runs with it.
True.
And how far is it till you get to Brave New World,
Right.
where all
For sure.
babies are conceived artificially and born in artificial wombs?
Right, 100%. And I agree, that's a total problem. And that's why all of these moments when medicine and science just barrels forward without asking the question, should we be doing it? It'll be us Christians who are willing to fight for life who have to mop up after them. That's been the story since the beginning of creation. It was the Jews who had to mop up after the moral evils of the pagans around them. It's the Christians who have to mop up the evils and bear the crosses that are created by those who are unwilling to look. And what a beautiful gift it is to be able to offer that to the world as those who believe in a God who is personal and loving. So my hope is that in talking about this issue, specifically with in vitro fertilization, is not only education for ourselves, but I wouldn't be surprised if in this room, even the few people, that we probably know someone who has sought this out, who's been interested in it. The first baby I ever baptized as a priest, I found out years later, was conceived and brought to term through IVF. Catholic couple. They were actually, I talked to them later once I found out and kind of gently brought the topic up and had conversations with them and the rest, and found out that they had gone to a priest who told them that it was okay. So there's this grave misinformation. I mean, because if you do just a quick Google search of is IVF okay, church approved, do Christians okay IVF, most of the first responses say, absolutely, it's a great gift. God gave us this ability to do it. Why would he not want us to do it, right? These are the arguments that are used. And none of those dig deeper into, okay, even though God has allowed us the use of reason, that doesn't mean we can't misuse our reason. We have so many proofs of how we can misuse our reason. So I don't want to end on a bad note. So let's end on a good note of here's all the evil that's being happening within the reproductive sphere. What is the good that we can take from this? The good that we can take from this is, one, is the body of Christ. We're all members of the body of Christ. And St. Paul is very clear, as one part suffers, we all suffer. And as one part rejoices, we all rejoice. We all probably know couples who are suffering with infertility, or ourselves have struggled with infertility in some way. That cross is a heavy cross to bear that we need to, I would argue, do somewhat better job of supporting those couples to not just understand the difficulty of that reality, but to find better solutions than what just their doctor's probably going to tell them. And that's an example of what Shauna gave just before me. She spoke about different ways to understand medicine and to better understand our own body and the rest. So I think that one way that a good thing we can do is by ourselves becoming educated, we will run into people who are struggling with infertility. We will run into situations where maybe our grandchildren or whatever, as they grow up, they then themselves are struggling with infertility. We can be a voice of reason and a voice of a good Christian conscience in their lives, so as to help guide them through that process. Because if they start the process without any Christian guidance, they will be incapable, because of the informed consent laws and the rest, of finding the truth. They'd have to dig a lot on their own. And the hard part is when we're in that place of suffering, we're not always looking for a way out of the answer that we found, right? We found an answer and we just want it, because we just want that baby so bad. And I don't blame people for that. But unfortunately, it does color our ability to make decisions in that moment. So that's one good thing, that as we are educated, we can then help those around us who are struggling with these different decisions. The other thing is there are actually responses that have taken place in legislators in other places in the world that have actually given proper limits to this whole process of IVF, this money making, and they make a ton of money in vitro fertilization. In Germany, there were laws passed, and I don't remember the years, I think it was in the 90s, that it's illegal. So there's legal ramifications if you conceive more than 3 children. So if you take 3 eggs and conceive more than that, there's legal ramifications. They're not allowed to freeze children, so they all have to be used immediately. So they don't have this snowflake problem where they have 500,000 children frozen. There's similar laws that got passed in Italy, but unfortunately, those are only 2 countries I know of that have made any kind of efforts to curtail this whole system. And I think it'd be even harder in America because, again, it is such a huge moneymaker and they have great lobbyists fighting for them. And we all know that process in our government. But again, on that good note, because we become more informed of this process and the grave damage that it's doing to men and women, to families, to children, then as pro-life advocates, this is another thing that we can begin to voice publicly our opinion on. Because again, in general, whenever I would take like generalized polls of crowds or whatever, before I even talk, is how many people think IVF is okay? And of course, most people will say no, because obviously it's a priest talking about IVF, so probably something's wrong, right? So it's a little bit of a biased poll, I understand that. But there's still plenty of hands that will go up. Or how many have known someone who have sought out help through in vitro fertilization clinics? And a lot of hands will go up. Again, that's our failure to teach, our failure to get the word out of what is actually taking place and happening in these places. So those are some of the good things. There's plenty more that we can do. Obviously, I always want to stress the reality of prayer. Prayer does change hearts. God is capable, and more than capable, of changing hearts and changing countries. We've seen that in our own country over the years for the good and bad and the rest, how we can resist grace, but prayer is not inconsequential when it comes to these topics. And I would say even more particularly, especially for any of those couples you know who have used this process, because even if we're not aware of the sin we've committed, we still suffer from the results, from what's left over. Right? And so I've seen this in these couples that use IVF, and specifically in the children. There actually is a whole branch of mental health now devoted to children who have been conceived outside of the normal means. Because they're finding a lot of the children, when they find out they've been conceived outside the normal means, they think, oh, was I just made by man now? Was I created? Was I designed by man? There's a lot of questions that they're coming up with. And there's a lot of kind of new news sites for teens and stuff like that are coming out with teens who are writing articles about these kind of experiences. And unfortunately, our culture doesn't help them deal with it. It just kind of affirms them in their victimhood. But just so we can be aware of, it's having generational kind of consequences upon our children and their concept of who they are, especially when the process uses not a husband and wife, but just a random donor for each. The child doesn't know who their mother is, and they don't know who their father is. I mean, just imagine how traumatic that is, just not having that knowledge. But that's what we've introduced into the world these days. So prayer is extremely effective and good for us to be making those sacrifices for these couples who are in these places and for these children who have been conceived, brought to birth, and are living with kind of what to do, how to process this. So that's a basic reality rundown of some of the principles that we can use when facing some of these infertility difficulties and the reproductive technologies offered to us. More than happy to answer any questions. If there are questions or comments to this topic or just moral ethics or whatever it might be. Great. Well, thank you for coming. Oh, you have a question?
Just pastorally,
Mm-hmm.
when you encounter a friend or family member who has a child, and I'm thinking of a friend in another state who kind of proclaims that that's how she
Sure.
it, but isn't practicing Catholic. It's not my place to correct her.
Sure.
But if she is seeking leadership in the parish, position of leadership, I guess what do you do?
Sure, yeah, no, the pastoral questions are always difficult, right? Because you're dealing with human hearts.
Yeah.
And so what I've found is in all of those cases, whenever we're trying to convert a heart, we start obviously with prayer, right? Because God alone converts hearts. We don't. God alone does that work. So we have to make sure we're working with him and not against him. We're following what he's doing. Obviously, he would love for her to find out the truth, to repent of any sin, and to change her life, right? So we know that reality. But how to get from where she's at to that point is a mystery to us. And the more we try to force that process, the further she's going to be from following that process often. We find this with our own children who maybe are away from their faith, right? The more we push them to come back, the further they go away. And so often in those cases, I always say, first you have to start with prayer and ask the Lord, Lord, is there something you want me to do? Right, so it starts with personal prayer and the direction that the Holy Spirit puts on our heart to, if we feel attracted to go talk to them or we feel convicted that this is something I need to do, follow that and see where it goes. If we feel discouragement or I don't think that it's the right time, follow that. See where, trust, just like we discern that, right? The other part is again, she probably, made that decision in ignorance. So many people don't actually know the moral reality of what was going on. Maybe they know that masturbation is a sin, and that's maybe what her husband had to do. But maybe they did it the morally right way. I don't know. So part of it is just asking her when she's proclaiming, I've done IVF. Well, tell me about that process. What was that like for you? And that might be painful to do, right? But that's Christ entering into the suffering with this woman and just listening to her story. Because pastorally speaking, with conversion, the only way to really convert is to enter into someone's story with them, and from that story, bring light with you. And so that'd be my encouragement, is to just hear her story. With this couple that I was working with, I just kept asking them, well, what was it like suffering as a young couple trying to conceive? And just letting them vent their heart and their struggles with that. I still have not got to the point of telling them, like, this was all wrong and you shouldn't have done it kind of thing. I've hinted at it, and I've noticed that it just comes immediately up against a brick wall that is just not touchable. And so you keep with them. Love them where they're at, not where you want them to be. So if that helps. Yeah, okay, good. Any other questions? Or great. Well, thank you. I hope it's helped in some way to better understand what's going on in our world. Thank you very much.